Okay, so we're on the air now, and I'm going to try to recapitulate what I just said, and that's difficult, but anyway, I'll give it a go. First, I want to remind you of the difference between active voice and passive voice in general. In an active voice sentence, the subject of the sentence is the doer of the deed, generally speaking. So in this sentence, for instance, he wrote a book, he is the subject, and he's the doer of the deed. He wrote the book, and the book is the object. Now, in a passive voice sentence, and there's also, hang on, let's also take this sentence, for instance. This is good. Mr. Smith bit my dog yesterday. So Mr. Smith was the doer of the deed, and he bit my dog. In an active voice sentence, the object is the receiver of the action. And maybe we can simply say the victim. You know, now in the case of the book was written, the book isn't the victim, but it's still more memorable if we say active voice, subject is doer of deed, passive voice, subject is receiver of deed or victim. Okay, so he wrote a book, that's active voice. And the book was written is passive voice. So the book was written, and then of course we have my dog was bitten yesterday. And in English especially, we often use the passive voice when either we want to focus on the victim and or the doer of the deed is either unimportant or unknown, or when we want to hide the doer of the deed, you know. And I didn't say that when I was offline, but I want to add this here. In German and in academic English and scientific English, the passive voice is often used to sound more objective and to become fuzzy. For instance, if I do, okay, Mr. Smith did an experiment on 2 rats and he found that, then we know, okay, there's Mr. Smith. Who is he? Oh, he's a nobody. And oh my God, he tortured rats. And oh my God, there were only 2 rats. But if we say studies show that, then, or a study was done. I'm sorry, that a study shows also active voice, but then we have a fuzzy subject. But a study was done. Then we have focus on a study, and it was done, and then it sounds very objective and academic. Anyway, but that's beside the point for right now, even though it's a very important point. Now, generally speaking, this is a good thing to remember. Active voice, subject, doer of deed. Passive voice, subject, recipient of deed, victim. And now we need a general recipe for English and German. And we can already see this a little bit here. Wrote is a main verb, and it's in the simple past. And in English and in German, it's in the simple present and in the simple past, the verb form consists of only one word, which is the main verb. Wrote and a bit. Now, in English, most passive voice tenses are constructed with the help of to be. Not all, but we will focus on the majority of cases for now. Just as a side note, to get and to become can also be used as passive voice auxiliaries, but we want to focus on to be right now. So we use the form of to be that we need with regard to person, I, we, it's he, she, it, whatever, person. Number, is it singular or plural? Tense, is it, present tense, present perfect, future, whatever. And aspect, is it simple tense or is it progressive tense? So we need to put to be in the same form that the active voice is in. So wrote is third person singular, simple past. So was has to be, no, hang on. So was has to be simple past, but whether it's singular or plural depends on the subject. Because, we could say he wrote many books, then we have third person singular, but many books were written. Then of course, whether it's the plural depends on the new subject. But we need to stay in the simple past. So we need to have the tense of the active voice verb in the simple, to be needs to be in the tense of the active voice verb. So this is simple past, was a simple past. In both cases, we happen to have third person singular, so we have third person singular in both active and passive voice, but that's a coincidence here. So that's taken care of, and then we need the past participle. And the past participle is, in English, it's one of the principal, or in English and German, it's one of the principal parts of the verb. When we learn principal parts, we learn the infinitive, to write. Then we learn the simple past form, which is wrote in this case. And then we learn the past participle, written. And in German it is schreiben, schrieb, geschrieben. In English it's write, wrote, written. And so we need this third form. Now, English also has regular verbs, which were formerly called weak verbs, and German has those too. And in English, in German, that's not the same, but in English, the simple past form, so the second part and the third form are the same, like love, love, loved, loved. So when I say he was loved, I'm using the past participle. I'm not using the simple past, but it looks like the simple past. Anyway, so this is, so for English, in order to construct a passive voice, we need to be in the tense, etc. that's called for, a form of to be. Let's say the necessary form of to be, or the appropriate form of to be, or the form of to be that's called for by the situation, plus the past participle. In German, we have sometimes grammarians distinguish between actional passive voice and statal passive voice. I don't want to go into this at this stage. Let's take the actional passive voice when we receive the action. And that kind of passive voice is produced with the help of the auxiliary werden. And there's an important thing. Werden can be a main verb, like he became a doctor. Er wurde Arzt. And when we use werden as a main verb, then the past participle is geworden. Er ist Arzt geworden. Er, that's a little side note here. Er ist Arzt geworden. He has become a doctor, but caveat, of course, English often uses the simple past when German uses the present perfect. It's a story for a different video. So, er ist Arzt geworden. So that's active voice. That's not, he's not doing anything right now, but that's he transformed. He became a doctor, right? He became a doctor. But when I say, or like I fixed a cake and the cake wasn't eaten, so der Kuchen ist schlecht geworden. That's also not passive voice. The cake turned bad, you know, but became, you know, it became moldy or whatever. So because we didn't eat it. And that's different from der Kuchen ist gegessen worden. So when we use werden as a passive voice auxiliary, we simply use worden as a past participle. And I couldn't find the answer for that anywhere. I looked in many different grammar books and online sites. My personal guess is that when we want to distinguish between the auxiliary past participle and the main verb past participle. So when you see geworden, you know it's active voice, or it's becoming, and when you see gegessen, you know it's the past participle of the main verb, and worden then is the past participle of the auxiliary, so you can nicely distinguish them. Also, it's easier to say. If you have to say der Kuchen ist gegessen geworden, that doesn't sound good. So I think because that makes it much easier, you know, language and water always want to take the more comfortable route or the path. And so this makes more sense. This is helpful and it's easier to say. So that's my guess. But it would have been nice if some of the books pointed this out. You know, werden is the same verb, but when you use it as an auxiliary to form the passive voice, then the past participle is worden. So, so we have Stammformen for to bite. Let's do translations here. He wrote, schrieb das Buch. Now I'm staying in the same tense. What I'm doing right now is not working on idiomatic German or English. I'm working on helping you to understand how to construct the forms in English and German. And when we work on constructing a form, then we can't pay attention to whether something is idiomatic or not, because right now we're working on your cognitive understanding of how to construct these forms. So if you want me to say something, explain something, or if you need a break, or if you have a question, interrupt me. Okay, so schrieb das Buch. That's his, I would often use the present perfect here in German. Hat das Buch geschrieben, but right now we want to stay in the same tense, so just so that you see this. Und the book was written. Das Buch. Now we need the simple past of werden, which is wurde. And then we need the past participle of schreiben, which is geschrieben. Das Buch wurde geschrieben. So here we go. Wurde geschrieben. So the here is the recipe for the German passive voice. Hang on. Let me put this somewhere else. Not to be confused with, how's that? Does that work? So, recipe for forming the forming a passive voice form in English. So take the necessary form of to be and add the past participle. And now we have the recipe for forming the passive voice in German. Take the necessary or the required form, let's say the required form or necessary, it doesn't matter, does it? Doesn't matter. Of werden and add the past participle. Der Kuchen ist gegessen worden. So that's the present perfect. And that's not to be confused with to be as a copular verb, as a link verb, where it is, he became a doctor. Er wurde Arzt. Der Kuchen, yeah, and in English you wouldn't say the cake became bad, it went bad, yeah. Okay, so that's on constructing the passive voice. So general difference between active and passive voice. We didn't write down the recipe. In the active voice, the subject of the sentence is the doer of the deed. Can we say it like this? I don't hear you. I can't hear you. In the passive voice, in a passive voice sentence, the subject is the recipient or victim of the deed, the receiver of the action. Okay? Clear so far? I can't hear you at all right now. I still can't hear you. Something happened. How
Hey.
odd. No, I can hear you. Yes.
Testing, testing, 1, 2.
Yes, now I can hear you.
Okay. No, everything is okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, good. So now we know the general difference
Mhm.
between the active and the passive voice. So this is how to construct it, right? Examples and recipe or recipes. And we did that. Now, should I add? Let me have a side note on participles.
Yes, please.
Participles comes from a Latin word which means to share or to take part in. And participles are words that share in the characteristics of both verbs and adjectives. They are verbal adjectives. So what are participles? Verbal adjectives. They are created out of verbs and they are dynamic adjectives. And they can be used to form tenses, and they can be used as adjectives, either adjectives that are modifiers, which in German are called Attribute, and adjectives that actually create clause elements. Example, this, just a very broad example, right? I have a longer thing on that. The sleeping dog, then we have an adjective, right? A participle as adjective. I am tired. We have a participle as predicate complement, as clause element. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Just very, very broadly speaking. And so we need to remember we have two basic participles. One is the present participle. And in English, it ends in ing, and in German in END, often, or AND. And beißend, lachend, oh, END always, I think. So laughing, lachend. And then we have the past participle, which is the third principal form of a verb. So here we have our examples. Gelacht and laughed and gelacht. Now, not all participles can fulfill all these functions. Not, laughed cannot always be a pre-modifier. You don't say the laughed dog, right? Oder der gelachte Hund. So, and laughing dog, you can say sometimes, but anyway, so semantically, that not all participles can fulfill all functions, but generally participles can fulfill the function. There's a difference between a general rule and a specific case, right? So when we learn English principal parts, we usually learn bite, bit, bitten. Bite is the infinitive, bit is the simple past, bitten is the past participle, and biting is the present participle. In German, it's beißen, bis, gebissen. Now, principal parts are always studied for the main, for these so-called irregular verbs, which were formerly called strong verbs, and they change these forms by like zum Beispiel schreiben, schrieb, geschrieben, essen, aß, essen, aß, gegessen, eat, ate, eaten, right? Something happens to the main vowel, to the root vowel, when you change principal parts often. So that's these irregular verbs, and so you simply need to learn them. They were more organized in former times, where you had 7 groups of strong verbs and you had these 7 basic patterns. But now there are only remnants of that, and that makes it look irregular, while they weren't irregular before. And the regular verbs in English are very simple, because the second form and the third form looks the same, like love, loved, loved. But in German it doesn't. Lieben, liebte, geliebt. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And these principal parts can be looked up in dictionaries and on the internet. Of course, it's good to learn the principal. Pardon?
I'm so happy that in Dutch is different.
Lieb, liebte, geliebt, yeah. Okay, so, but it's very important to remember these are not the same forms. So when you say he was loved, wurde geliebt, then this is not in English, that's also the past participle. It just happens to look like the simple past. So anyway, so this is enough on participles for now, I think. Participles are extremely wonderful creatures. So you can use them to build tenses as adjectives in various capacities, and you can use them as heads of reduced clauses. And that's very, very often done, especially in English, but also in German. And I have way more to say about that, but this was a basic introduction, and we're doing passive voice right now. Now, we want a first set of examples for passive voice, and then we want to do it systematically. Are you still with me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Let's save this. So, first set of examples. Now, Mr. Smith often bites dogs. That's active voice. Mr. Smith is biting my dog right now. This is the present progressive tense. Mr. Smith bit my dog yesterday. Simple past, active voice. Active voice here, active voice. Mr. Smith has just bitten my dog, present perfect. Watch out, or else Mr. Smith will also bite your dog, will future. Now, I'm putting them here into the passive voice. So, Mr. Smith often bites dogs becomes dogs are often bitten by Mr. Smith. So, this is present, simple present. So, are is in the simple present. And then we have the past participle. And one thing to add to participles, when we hear present participle, we associate that with the present, but that's not true. The present participle can be an adjective in a sentence that's said in the past or in the future, and the past participle can form a passive voice future tense. So we have to somehow divorce the idea of tense and participle. All progressive tenses, all 7 progressive tenses in English end in ing, in the present participle, regardless of whether we're dealing with the past, the present, or the future. And all passive voice constructions end with or contain as a main verb the past participle of the main verb, regardless of whether we are moving in the past, the present, or the future. That's so important to remember. So applying this recipe, we need the form of to be plus the PP, the past participle in English. We need a form of werden plus the past participle in German. Just remember that. And in that connection, remember, when we learn this, I'm always a huge fan of immersion. So immerse yourself in the language you want to study, in your case in German, like crazy. So listen to the radio, watch TV, listen to audiobooks, watch YouTube videos, whatever you can do, podcasts, songs, input. And that's the main thing. Then when we learn tenses and the passive voice, for instance, then we use our cognition and we apply these recipes to construct this. Then we go and we look at text and see, can we spot the tense? Can we spot whether it's active or passive voice? And then the next step is, okay, I'll give you an active voice sentence and you apply the recipe and you turn it into a passive voice sentence, or the other way around, so that we can practice tenses and we can practice active and passive voice. And then you can look at texts and see, okay, I can spot the tense, I can spot whether it's active or passive voice, and I know why. And then if you keep applying your cognition to recognizing patterns and recipes, and then memorizing patterns, and then simultaneously engage in immersion, then eventually you'll be able to put those together and produce the correct thing. So I don't believe, and I'm convinced from all the evidence that I've seen, that we do not learn by simply speaking. When we speak, we practice what we know. And if we know mistakes, we practice those. When we speak and write, we can also find out what we don't know and then learn that. But we do not first learn by production. We learn by immersion and imitation. So first we immerse, then we actively listen, then we imitate, and then we play. And production comes much later, and then happens simultaneously while we keep immersing ourselves and keep imitating and keep playing. So that's true for everything, not only for tenses and the active and the passive voice. Okay, so now we are here with Mr. Smith is biting my dog right now. My dog is being bitten by Mr. Smith right now. In the simple present and the simple past, we can actually form a progressive tense in the passive voice, not in the other tenses there. It doesn't make sense. So is being bitten. The plans are being discussed as we speak. Now we have the simple past here. Mr. Smith bit my dog. So we need the simple past of to be plus the past participle. My dog was bitten by Mr. Smith yesterday. Mr. Smith has just bitten my dog. My dog's still bleeding and Mr. Smith is still blood on his mouth. Then it just has happened. So then we need the present perfect in English as well. And so we need the present perfect of to be, which is has been, plus the past participle. My dog has just been bitten by Mr. Smith. Watch out, or else your dog will be bitten by Mr. Smith. We have the will future, which consists of will plus the infinitive in the active voice. We use will be, which is to be in the future tense, plus the past participle. So here we have the future tense and it ends with the past participle because it's the passive voice. Now we'll look at the same thing in German, shall we? Okay, Mr. Smith often bites dogs. Mr. Smith beißt oft Hunde. Mr. Smith is biting my dog right now. Mr. Smith beißt gerade meinen Hund. In standard German, we do not have a progressive tense. We we express the progressive aspect with the verb, with the help of adverbs or idiomatic expressions. Here in the Rhineland, where I live, we can say, der ist gerade den Hund am beißen, but I don't speak Rhinelandish enough, or so I can't. It has its own rules, but there is a progressive tense in some dialects, but main standard German doesn't have that. Also beißt gerade meinen Hund, he is biting my dog right now. Mr. Smith hat gestern meinen Hund gebissen. Big thing. Usually when we talk about the past in colloquial language or in everyday language, we don't use the simple past that much. So I wouldn't actually teach it to people who are learning German, and not during the first phase. So Mr. Smith bit my dog yesterday because the action is over and done with and it happened yesterday. I must use the simple past in standard English. But in German, I can, and I should actually use the present perfect. Very confusing. Anyway, Mr. Smith hat gestern meinen Hund gebissen. Yeah, of course, I can just for purposes say, biss meinen Hund gestern. I would never say that, but just so you know, it would be bissen. Now, and then we have Mr. Smith has just bitten my dog. Now it's lovely in both languages. Mr. Smith hat gerade eben meinen Hund gebissen. So, hat gebissen, has bitten. So you see the construction of tenses is very similar in English and German, except of course that English only has the builds its present tense always with a form of to have, and German doesn't, which is the story of another day. Okay, pass bloß auf, sonst wird Mr. Smith auch noch deinen Hund beißen. Of course, here I could also say in German, pass auf, sonst beißt er auch noch deinen Hund. I can use the simple present to talk about the future in German. I simply stick an adverbial or some kind of other evidence of future time into the sentence and then I'm good to go. Also, morgen gehe ich einkaufen oder morgen werde ich einkaufen gehen. I often use the simple present plus a future tense adverbial. Morgen mache ich das. In English, you can absolutely not do that. That's very difficult for German learners. Anyway, pass bloß auf, sonst wird Mr. Smith auch noch deinen Hund beißen. In order to make it easier, I stuck with a simple, with a future tense in both languages. So now we'll work on putting the German sentences in the passive voice. Mr. Smith beißt oft Hunde. Simple present. So we need werden in the simple present plus the past participle. Hunde werden oft von Mr. Smith gebissen. Ja. Mein Hund wird gerade von Mr. Smith gebissen. So beißt gerade. My dog. So we need this the third person singular. Wird gebissen, but it's still the present tense. Sie werden gebissen, wird gebissen. Mein Hund ist gestern von Mr. Smith gebissen worden. Present perfect ist worden, present perfect of the auxiliary without the GE prefix, and then the past participle of the main verb. And notice the difference between German and English here. In German, we stick everything in between the auxiliary and the past participles. And English doesn't do that. And that is so difficult for both sets of learners. So, has just been bitten. We have a nice verb phrase. Everything is in there. A few adverbs sometimes find their way into this verb phrase, but just a certain small number of verbs. But we don't put the agent in there. We don't put time adverbials in there. But look at, we have the time adverbial gestern. We have the agent von Mr. Smith. And if we wanted to have an adverb like severely, mein Hund ist gestern von Mr. Smith ganz schlimm gebissen worden. So whatever we have, we stick in between the auxiliary and the past participles. And that is so hard and I apologize. Okay. Now, if we wanted to use the simple past, which is called Präteritum in German, we do the simple past of werden, which is wurde, and then we add the PP, the past participle. Mein Hund wurde gestern von Mr. Smith gebissen. And finally, plural, pass bloß auf, sonst wird dein Hund noch von Mr. Smith gebissen werden. Gebissen muss dahin. Ups, gebissen. Sometimes things happen. Also, pass bloß auf, wird gebissen werden. Wird werden is the future tense of werden, and then we have the past participle of bite. Okay, so that's your basic introduction to the passive voice. Now, what I would like to do, was that okay? Do you have questions?
Perfect.
Okay, good.
We are
Thank
so
you.
happy.
That's good. So now what I would like to do is I would actually take one sentence and put it through all the tenses. Remember, there are 7 basic tenses in English, even though some grammarians say there are only 2, but for practical purposes, there are 7 tenses in English, and for practical purposes, there are 6 tenses in German. Because English has 2 future tenses, the going to future and the will future, and German actually in some way has also 2 tenses because we use the present tense to express the future plus, but we have only one future tense, Futur 1 we say, and we construct that with werden as well. So werden is the auxiliary that we use to express the to form future tenses and to form passive voice constructions. So as I said before, in English, the very important words to learn for all learners are to be, to have, and to do. In German, it's to be, sein, haben, und werden. Sein, haben, werden. Those are the very, very important words. And we'll do a session on those again Sein, haben, werden. You need sein to construct all these type 3 sentences, like he is sweet, he's an English teacher. You need haben to construct the past, the present and the past perfect.
Mhm.
And you need sein for the perfect of verbs of movement and for to be and for werden. And then you need werden for the future and for the passive voice. So these are your 3 most important verbs, and please, 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 let's learn them. Let's learn these. But now I would simply take a sentence, and when we walk one sentence through all the tenses in the active and the passive voice, we will end up with some unidiomatic sentences. Right now, the focus is not on great German or English, on very idiomatic English. Right now, it's merely on how do you form a tense. It's merely on the construction part. And because people are so afraid of, on the one hand, on one hand, people are afraid of non-idiomatic English or unidiomatic English, let's say, and then don't and shy away from these academic drills. But at the same time, they never give students this framework to hold on to, right? Mm-hmm. And I keep saying that if you do enough immersion and you just want German or English for conversational purposes, you do not need to study grammar. Grammar helps you, well, grammar makes you smarter, and grammar helps you when you do text analysis and text production. And it can help you study if it's used as a helper tool, not as the master. That in the institutions that we know, language acquisition and language instruction and language learning are confused. And the poor victims are, the students are the victims of that endeavor, but that's a story for another day. Okay, so we'll walk something through all tenses. And I think we'll simply take essen, to eat. Shall we do that? We'll do...
My concern is, are you still recording, right?
I'm still recording, yes.
And you were talking about 5 steps to master this?
Yes, the 5 steps to master is first understand how to construct tenses in active and passive voice. So that's, and there are recipes in English and in German. And I gave you the recipe for passive voice, right, in English and in German. So first you understand the construction principle. Then you learn to spot verb phrases and to identify, okay, you know, like beißt. You see that if you were to see that in a text, you could say, okay, beißt, that's the 3rd person singular of beißen. Yes?
Can we write these 5 steps?
Yes, the 5 steps. So if you want the 5 steps for A or 1, no, I don't want this automatic stuff. There. First, understand how to form whatever, yeah, verb tenses, the verb forms. How to form tenses, including active and passive, including positive form, negative form, question form. I won't write that down, right? Okay. Secondly, so you understand how to form them, and then the second step, there are 2 ways. And the next step is learn how to identify them. Then apply that understanding to texts. Learn to be able to spot and identify tenses or verb forms. Right? Does that make sense?
Yes. Yes.
So, thirdly, you learn when to use, or no, actually the 3rd step is be able to do guided transformation. Learn to do guided transformations, like we did here. Er beißt, wird gebissen. So I give you this sentence and I say, okay, now apply the rule. Okay, we have German, so we take werden, we see, or Hunde is our subject now. It's plural, so I use the present tense in the plural of werden, Hunde werden, and then I use the PP, the past participle, Hunde werden gebissen. So I learn these guided transformations. That means I do not have to worry about finding the correct verb, creating an idiomatic expression, and I do not need to think about anything except simply applying the recipe, right? And the fourth step is to learn when to use which tense and mode, etc. So learn understand and learn when to use which tense, form, or tense, etc. Right? So this includes, okay, we use the present perfect in German to talk about the past. And in English, when the past is over and done with, you must use the simple past. So that's something that we need to learn. So we learn them, and understand and learn when to use which tense. And that's often wise to learn that in contrast. Because as a speaker of German, when I want to talk about the past, I intuitively want to do this transfer, you know? So I use the present perfect in German, so I will use the present perfect in English. No, think again, right? So once you understand this, then at least when you understand, you can then read a text and you say, oh, there's the simple past. Ah, that's right. That's over and done with. So in English, I need to use the simple past. Or I'm reading a German text and there's the present perfect, and I go, okay, it's still the simple past. It would be the simple past in English because it's over and done with. And in German, as I told you before, and will tell you again, in German, we can actually stick the simple past and the present perfect into one sentence. I can say, and other people do say, and I do too, ich war beim Bäcker und ich habe dir ein paar Brötchen gekauft. Statt ich bin beim Bäcker gewesen und habe dir ein paar Brötchen gekauft. But that's a story for another day. So you learn to understand and learn when to use which tense, and then simultaneously simultaneously you immerse yourself, and so you passively soak up all there is, and immerse yourself. Get there. And then and then after you've done that, you eventually will end up able to produce what you need to produce. But anyway, whenever we learn, immersion, listening, and imitation are the first steps. You know, immersion, listening, imitation, and then playing. That's always true for all language acquisition. And then for tenses, you do this. Does that help?
Yes.
Okay, good. Now, should we do the, we'll take Essen. Yes, question? Yes.
No question. I think this part that you explained right now is long enough for one video.
Okay, should I stop?
We can stop the video now and then we can start step by step, maybe.
Okay. Okay, I'll stop the recording then. Hang on.